Morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. My name is Karen Berman. I'm the CEO of the American Society for University of Haifa, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our post-election briefing on the Israeli elections. As many of you may know, University of Haifa is renowned for its entire humanities program, but especially its School of Political Science, which is really one of Israel's leading teaching and research institutions, with Israel really being at the epicenter of constantly changing international political developments. It's very important that its universities do have deep research in this expertise, and we are proud to have been recognized for our expertise in Middle East political movements, international relations, and political theory. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by our very own Professor Ehud Eiran, who is an Associate Professor of International Relations in our School of Political Science at University of Haifa, and he's also a visiting scholar right now at the Department of Political Science in Stanford University. So it's early for him, and it's a little bit late for Noah Amoil, who's joining us today from Haifa and from Tel Aviv, actually, and helping us moderate this conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to the two of you, and they'll lead us through this discussion. And also Noah will give us some tips if you have any questions for us at the end, how to submit those questions.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining in. If you have any questions, as Karen said, there's a little button at the bottom of your screen saying Q&A, so feel free to send any questions you have there, and we will answer them toward the end of our conversation. As you all know, Israel went to the polls last night for the third time in a little over a year, and like most issues in Israel, it's complicated. So we have here Professor Eiran, who's going to break down what happened yesterday, and we'll talk about the significance of the results. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the Friends of University of Haifa for arranging this opportunity, and for all of you who are watching and listening for your interest in Israel and support to the university. Last night, as Noah mentioned, Israel polls were closed at 10 p.m. Israel time. I should start by saying that these are preliminary results. The counting is not fully finished. Usually the last votes that are counted are soldiers, which is a young demographic, which tends to vote currently more right-wing, so there still may be tweaks to the results. The main highlights of the results are Likud, Prime Minister Netanyahu's party, emerges on top with 36 seats. The main contender, Blue and White, 32 seats, and then 6 other parties in various degrees. But as you know, Israeli politics is determined by the blocs, in other words, the ability to set a coalition rather than which party wins the most votes. And in this, we don't have a clear resolution. Prime Minister Netanyahu can master 59 seats for a bloc, whereas he needs at least 61. So at least on the face of it, all options are open, including a unity government, and potentially even a fourth elections.
So if I understand you correctly, we are basically where we were last September. Even though it seems like there's a victory for Likud.
Yes, there are some tweaks. Netanyahu is facing a lot of difficulties. He's going on trial for corruption allegations March 17th. And he did, despite that, he was able to bring more seats than the 2 other previous elections. The second main interesting development is the rise of the Arab vote. There's one main Arab list that has 15 seats for now. This is 50% more than they had in the April elections. So there are some tweaks, but generally we are where we were before. That's correct.
So that's very interesting, and I certainly want to revisit that point. But first, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about your expertise, which is specializing in international developments and how they impact Israel. So with that said, how has one election after another election impacted how the world sees, quote unquote, the only democracy in the Middle East?
So to be honest, I'm not sure these internal difficulties had much effect on Israel's foreign relations. As you know, these are determined by big structural forces, who's in power in the world, what are the relationships between Israel and its allies. And these, I think, are pretty much affected by these realities. We have a weak Arab world, so our immediate foes are rather weak. There's a strong bond between Israel and the United States, still the world's leading great power. And Netanyahu himself, to his credit, has been quite effective in managing some of the challenges. As you may know, we have now a Russian armed force deployed in Syria, which limits our freedom of operations. Netanyahu is quite effective in managing these complicated relationships. And in general, in most countries, maybe the US is a bit of an exception, it is the executive rather than the legislator that manages foreign relations. So, and add to that a global trend of leaders who are somewhat similar to Netanyahu, more right-wing, perhaps more populist. So in a convenient international and regional environment and a strong executive, I think this did not have a major effect on our foreign relations.
So speaking about Netanyahu and what he's good at, what did he do right this time? What did the Likud party do right?
So first of all, as we said, it's not a major difference from what we saw before. There's a slight achievement. There was a very effective on-the-ground work, which had to do with better use of big data. It's a bit similar to the Obama campaign in 2012. And secondly, because of an internal development in the Likud, in December 2019, for the first time in a long time, there was a serious contender in Likud, Gideon Sa'ar. So this forced Netanyahu to revisit towns and reconnect with party activists. And this internal energy, which led to his internal victory in December, was then carried on in the next 2 months. And finally, Likud used, for lack of a better word, some dirty tactics, doctored movies, and highlighting some rumors against Benny Gantz, which were quite well. And the last thing is, Netanyahu was quite effective in placing people who are more sympathetic to him in the bureaucracy, and one of these people brought charges against Gantz, or against Gantz's former company, the Fifth Dimension, which, although it's much weaker than what's alleged against Netanyahu, was able to frame in the public opinion that both sides have some legal issues.
Sure. And speaking of Benny Gantz, he just can't seem to take a break. To catch a break. What advice would you give him should he decide to continue campaigning if we see a fourth campaign? What would you tell him to do differently this time around?
Yeah, first, as you know, the party has 4 people at the top, 3 former chiefs of staff, and Yair Lapid, a former entertainer who became a politician. So first of all, it remains to be seen if he will lead the party in the 4th elections. At least one of the other generals, Gabi Ashkenazi, is perceived as more, perhaps more energetic and with slightly better capabilities of approaching a broader audience. So I think his first task will be to make sure that he remains the leader. Secondly, I don't want to give advice, partly because in a previous career I was in politics and worked for the government, so I know how our advice sometimes is too far removed. But it seems that the message was not as clear. It was mostly around removing Netanyahu, but in a lot of the substantial issues, such as annexation of the Jordan Valley, they offered similar positions. So I think a preliminary marketing approach would be to try and differentiate yourself from the competition in a sharper way.
What do you make, though, about how much, if any, influence Donald Trump might have had on this election? He continues to be very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and especially Netanyahu's last trip to Washington continue to display their warm relations. Do you think that also impacted Gantz?
Impacted Gantz or Netanyahu's abilities?
Impacted Gantz in a negative way, where people said, oh, well, the President of the United States likes this guy, Gantz not so much. Maybe that swayed people. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so Prime Minister Netanyahu built essentially his political career on his ability to communicate with American elites, beginning in his first appointment as our deputy ambassador to Washington in the 80s. As you may know, he was an American citizen, trained at MIT, went through all the elite institutions that American society has to offer. So all along his career, one of his claims for legitimacy within the Israeli public was his ability to communicate and be effective dealing with the administration. He's been particularly effective because he took a gamble to tweak a bit Israel's commitment to bipartisan support and gambled on closer relationship with the Republicans, including President Trump. He did try to use it in the campaign. In the previous elections in September, many of the billboards described him as this great international leader. It had pictures of him with Trump, with the Chinese Secretary General, and so on. In these elections, although he received favorable treatment from Trump, including a deal of the century, this American peace proposal that was perceived as very pro-Israel, it did not seem to affect the polls. Immediately after the deal of the century was presented, there was no major change. So of course, it's in his benefit, but if you will, it's a constant for a long time, this image of effective communicator abroad.
Mm-hmm. One thing that many found surprising about the elections yesterday was it was the highest voter turnout since 1999. It sort of defies logic that after two elections and we go to the polls again, that you'd have such a showing at the voting box, but that's the case. How do you explain it?
So I think there are a few explanations. The biggest one perhaps is the participation of Israel's Arab citizens. In the April 2019 elections, around 50% came to vote, and there were only 10 seats representing Arab parties. Almost a year later, they are 50% higher, 15 seats, with the percentage in the polls almost 70, so it's almost the general percentage. This is one of the negative, the adverse effects of the Trump proposal, which included a transfer of some Arab villages close to the future border with Palestine to Palestine, which many Israeli Arab citizens don't want to do. And so this was a rallying force for them. Secondly, Likud, as I mentioned, was far more effective in reaching out to its own base. Netanyahu's, many of his adverts in the last few weeks literally showed how he knocks on doors and asks people to vote. Plus this usage of new technology that allowed to create these long lists of who is probably our voter and we should maybe energize them. And finally, but this is somewhat more anecdotal that I hear from friends, I didn't see it in any polling, many people wanted to get this over with and a concern that we will go to a fourth election. Maybe really we have to make a decision this time. There's one other element, and that's Corona. In previous elections, people, as you know, in Israel, it's a day off from work. So people sometimes go abroad, go to public places. And Corona, I think, there's less people flying out, less people who go out to public places. And so they went to polling stations instead.
Yes, so that's all very compelling. But about the Arab parties, do you think that this indicates that they'll perhaps be a greater part of participating Israeli society? Because up until now, they've sort of been on the outskirts, disenfranchised, and kind of pushed to the margins. But 14 to 15 seats is quite significant. Do you think this is the beginning of a trend?
So I think we're witnessing with Israel's Arab citizens two conflicting trends. On the other hand, on one hand, on the political level, the delegitimacy to their participation is growing. Both, of course, Netanyahu, but also Benny Gantz said they will not sit in a coalition with the Arab parties. This is not ethnic, it's mostly a representation of the specific ideas of these parties, which object to the current at least some of the Arab elements in these parties object to Israel's self-characterization as a Jewish state. On the other hand, the size, as you rightly point, Noah, but also some cultural trends, I think, do make it more legitimate. For example, the party was very effective in reaching for the first time to Jewish voters, including meetings in Jewish communities and so on. And secondly, the sheer power makes everyone look at them more seriously. We know now, for example, that Netanyahu secretly negotiated with the most Islamist element in this party and tried to get them in the previous round to support him in some way. So the combination of somewhat cultural shifts and the political realities will, in my view, make them a more legitimate participant in our electoral politics.
And then the question on everyone's mind now is what's next? How do we get to 61? How does Netanyahu get to 61? Does he get to 61? And are we set to repeat this again in 6 more months?
First of all, we have to wait for the final results, especially because we're waiting for soldiers' votes. Likud may still get closer to 61. The possibilities for Likud, which is in a more comfortable position, will be to try and encourage individual members of parties on the other bloc to defect. There are a few potential candidates. The problem is that under Israeli law, if you defect from your party, not in a large enough group, you cannot run in the next elections in a party. There is at least one member of Knesset, I won't go into the details, but it is possible for her to do it without the punishment. It seems that Likud already identified 2 or 3 potential people they may approach. Second option is to go to some sort of national unity government. In the previous round, after the September elections, there were talks between Blue and White and Netanyahu about a national unity government. Our president, which is usually more of a symbolic figurehead, did offer some structure for such a national unity government. And then there is a possibility for 4th election, but it seems that this time many of the politicians are committed not to go for a 4th election.
One thing that struck me when I was watching the news as the exit polls were coming in last night is not a lot of pundits were giving any analysis about the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to trial in 2 weeks. So how does that impact the election? Could that prevent him from actually forming a government if Mandelblit decides that he can't do it because it's a conflict of interest as he's going to face trial at the same time?
So as you rightly point, there's the next arena, if you will, is the legal arena. The trial begins September 17th. Potentially will start with testimony as early as, maybe it's not that early, in the late summer and early fall, which means it has a few implications. First of all, these elections to some extent were not simply about leadership and vision, but about Netanyahu's survival as a free person. It seems that he thinks that being tried as a prime minister will give him greater chances of being acquitted, maybe even potentially affecting the process. For example, appointing a new attorney general that will stop the proceedings. There is a procedure in the law that allows the prosecution to halt prosecution for all sorts of reasons. I don't think it will affect his ability to create a coalition. All these allegations were spread out and still Likud got 36 votes. All the parties on the right from his bloc committed to going with him regardless of the legal situation. The legal system, the discussion about the legal system is not simply about did he do this or not, but it reflects a deeper cultural resentment among sectors of the Israeli population against a judicial system that's perceived perhaps as more liberal. So it's definitely the next big question, but it will not, in my view, affect immediately coalition setting, with one exception, and that is Blue and White did commit their voters that they will not sit with Netanyahu while he's being tried. And so this will require extra creativity to create a national unity government and overcome this question. For example, making sure Netanyahu will be the second person as prime minister if they share power.
So doing that rotation thing that was discussed in September.
Yeah, national unity government in this context, it will mean a rotation. Just both parties don't trust each other, so everyone wanted to be first. And because Netanyahu is going now to the trial, he desperately wanted to be first.
I actually have an interesting question from one of our listeners, Michael Trazen. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He asks that Trump's deal of the century seems to evoke objections by Israeli Arabs who are threatened with finding the triangle in Palestine. Will this generate greater patriotism, and is Israel in a post-Zionist stage?
Maybe I'll start with the second one. I don't think we're in a post-Zionist state. To the contrary, there's sort of resurgence of Zionism. The 1990s and perhaps early 2000s, Israeli elites were swept in this moment of globalization, the internet, American dominance, And I think for a number of reasons, some of them are evident in other countries, there's actually a resurgence of Zionism, including on the younger people now are more patriotic, quote unquote, or more right-wing or more nationalistic, as we see in polling compared to 20 years ago. We have civil society organizations that are adopting names from the early days of Zionism, like a Shomer Chadash. This is an armed group that existed in the beginning of the 20th century. So I don't think we're in a post-Zionist phase. There is a group that wants to redefine Zionism or does want to redefine the state in a way that's maybe more civil, ethnocentric, but this group got a serious beating in the elections. It's the Labour Meretz Gesher party. They have only 7 seats. The first question was, are Israeli Arabs now being threatened to be a part of Palestine? Will they be more patriotic? If I understand the question, no?
Yes. What does that mean for the Israeli Arabs? Because you're seeing, if I understand his question correctly, you're seeing a push-pull where they're being more involved in politics, but you also have this Trump deal of the century that they are very against. So maybe there's a correlation there.
So the Israeli Arab population, Israeli Palestinian population is facing conflicting trends. Their political leadership, these 15 seats, hold generally to traditional Arab nationalist approaches, with the exception of one party that is more religious, but is still deeply committed to the Palestinian cause. On the other hand, on the day-to-day life, Israeli Palestinians are much more involved in economic life, in interactions, things that we did not see before, like celebrated relationship, romantic relationship between Jews and Arabs are more out in the open. Gideon Saar, the gentleman, the right-wing gentleman that competed against Netanyahu, his daughter, who is an actress, is dating an Arab actor. If you go in Israeli malls, many of the people who are selling you are Arabs. The chairman of Israel's bank, that was initially called the Bank for Colonization of Palestine, Bank Leumi, the national bank, is an Arab. So we see these conflicting forces on this population. And I think, like many things in Israel, we somehow have to hold these competing tensions in our reality.
So do you think perhaps we'll see a future in 20, 30 years where Arab society can live alongside Jews in a Jewish state, or is that still, I guess, a pipe dream, as some might say?
First of all, they are living next to each other. I mean, the way I think about it always, you should think of Israel as a country that emerged from a civil war in 47, 49, in which one side was severely defeated, the Palestinians, many of them left and never came back. A huge sore point and debated. And so we'll have to find some way to overcome this deep distrust between the two sides. There are signs now in both directions. As I said, delegitimacy to Arabs on one hand, which can lead to much harder things than we have now. Or on the other hand, greater involvement just as reality creates. If you look at the period where Palestine was controlled by the British, and this was one political unit, there were joint Jewish-Arab businesses. There were much greater exchanges than what we see today. So it's very hard to make a prediction. I think the single biggest determinant will be the future of the West Bank, which has over 2 million Palestinians. Israel's right wing is leading essentially to the creation of one political entity in which there will be close to an Arab majority. And so this will force this way or another some drastic change in the current political structures. But this is decades ahead, I think.
Yes, and I guess the final question that we have before we wrap up is about fake news and deep fakes. You were talking about the dirty tricks of the Likud. One was a video of Benny Gantz doctored to make it seem like he's encouraging people not to vote for him. So how much are we going to be seeing these kinds of videos in the future, and is there a way to stop it?
So this is a great question, a fascinating question across the board. Today, as our American viewers know, it's Super Tuesday. I saw that in an unprecedented way, all the entities in the American intelligence community came out with a strategy to deal with deep fakes here in the US. Technology, of course, is adding to this. We are very close to the moment where technology can have someone that we trust, like Gantz, not simply doctoring a video, but actually making him talk and say whatever you write on the computer. So technology offers a huge challenge not only to Israel, but all democracies in this sense. And maybe I'll say there's three levels to think about it. First of all, it challenges the foundations of democracy. But these were questions we had before in dictatorships in the 30s, in media control in countries like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And this will require some resolution on a much more philosophical level, because it asks, how do we as people determine where we vote? And the second level is almost a tactical level. If you get a video like the one Noah just mentioned of a leader saying the opposite of what we'd expect, how do you ascertain if it's right or wrong? And many countries are trying different methods. My kids who go to here in school are trained in the school how to see if an internet site is right or wrong. If you go on the site of the Israeli Electoral Commission, they have a special section how to deal with fake news, but these are very preliminary efforts. So I guess in short, we are going to see more of this. There are efforts to try and combat that. The efforts are far from complete.
Right. And sorry, a bunch of questions are actually coming in at the last moment, which is very exciting. So one question, 1 second. What significant changes occurred in the election which might signal new patterns in future elections? For example, you talked about the joint list and you talked about labor dwindling. Do you see that only being exacerbated or being more pronounced in the future?
Yeah, great question again. I think there are a few things. First of all, as Noah highlighted earlier, there's a greater sense of the force of the Arab voters, combined with the decline of the progressive Zionists, the party that once led the country and controlled our politics from 1933 to 1977. Labor is decreased to 7 seats out of 120. So there is a sense that the progressive Zionists are at the end of the road, which may lead to some unity across ethnic lines between Zionist, progressive, and Arab parties. That's one trend. Secondly, on a more tactical level, Gantz may not survive as leader, and this big block of middle class, center of the country voters that vote for blue and white will be captured by someone. The party was only created a bit more than a year ago, blue and white, the second biggest party, and this block may be up for grabs down the road.
And then I'll close with one last question from the audience. How long can we expect the Netanyahu era to last? He can't live forever, and he can't be cloned. So eventually there has to be an end. What do you think? How long do you think it'll last, and what do you think will happen to Israel in the post-Netanyahu era?
Yeah, so the question of the Netanyahu legacy is great and interesting on many, many levels. There is a sense that a bit like the way Donald Trump had changed American politics, some of the approaches that Netanyahu introduced focus on tensions in society rather than being a unified character. The use of tricks that are borderline will remain because it's been effective. The challenge he poses to the legal system, again, a bit like in other countries, part of Netanyahu's effort is to weaken, if you will, the independence of the legal system, or in his view, making it less independent and against the popular vote. So I think his legacy is there to stay even if he goes. The first immediate question about his political survival is the result of the trial. We never had a sitting prime minister who was on trial, who has to sit in court in the morning and decides whether to attack Iran in the afternoon. The only other prime minister that was put on trial, Ehud Eiran, resigned shortly before the trial began. And in the earlier days, in the 70s, Prime Minister Rabin resigned even when there were allegations raised against him. So the legal thing, you know, we may end up seeing him in jail, which will end his time. Under Israeli legal precedent, ministers who are on trial have to resign, but not necessarily the prime minister. So there's going to be a legal challenge to the Supreme Court to challenge his ability to stay in power while he's on trial. But there's a long sense for over 22 years that we are at the end of the Netanyahu era, hence the internal rebellion in Likud, hence Lieberman turning away from him. Lieberman was a close ally. But this ending is longer than anyone expected. But I think still there's a sense that this is the last part of his long tenure.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for shedding some light on a very complex political system here in Israel. And thank you for the listeners for tuning in and asking your questions. We will be forwarding a video, full video of the briefing tomorrow. And thank you everyone for participating. It's been a pleasure.